In chapter 15, we are going to talk about a plethora of different psychological disorders. And so I think you'll like this chapter because when most people think of psychology, this is what they actually think about. All the crazy, psychological disorders that you hear about in the movies and on shows like Criminal Minds and in the media and on the news and things like that. So I think you'll really enjoy this chapter and kind of get an eye-opening experience about what psychological disorders are all about. We're also going to talk about the DSM, which is the manual that we use to diagnose individuals with disorders. So the first module is module 46, and we're going to talk about what is normal and what is abnormal, and making this distinction between the two. So we have 3 questions we're going to answer in this module. The first one is, how can we distinguish normal from abnormal behavior? The second one is, what are the major perspectives on psychological disorders that are used by mental health professionals? So we'll talk about how your physicians, your psychologists, your psychiatrists, your social workers, your school counselors, what are those major perspectives that those people use in order to diagnose someone with a disorder? And then the last thing we're going to talk about is, what are the major categories of psychological disorders? So we'll talk about the various categories, and then in module 47, the next one, we'll talk about all the different disorders. So let's start out with defining abnormality, what we mean by abnormal. Psychologists overall struggle to devise a precise scientific definition of abnormal behavior. There is so much that goes into what is considered abnormal. And I don't know if there's any sort of agreed upon definition for abnormal behavior. What we do know is 5 different things. We do know that it's a deviation from average or normal behavior. We do know that it is a deviation from the ideal. We do know that it produces this sense of personal discomfort within the person that has the disorder. We know that when someone has an abnormal behavior, that it causes them this inability to function effectively in their environment. And then we do know that it is a legal concept. You can use abnormal behavior as a legal concept to define someone who is legally insane, let's say. Now, what we define as legally insane, that can vary from one jurisdiction to another. There is no overriding law that says this is what someone needs to be identified as legally insane. That can change from one jurisdiction to the next. Overall, abnormal behavior causes people to experience both distress, and it prevents them from functioning in their everyday lives. We are going to spend the next couple of slides looking at various perspectives on abnormal behavior, from superstition to actual science that is conducted. We have a few different perspectives. I'd say there's probably 5 or 6 different perspectives that we're going to talk about on it. Think of these perspectives kind of like as theories, right? What a group of scientists believe is the cause, or what they use to determine abnormal behavior. So the first one is a medical perspective. And this suggests that when an individual displays symptoms of abnormal behavior, the root cause will be found in some sort of physical examination of the individual. So from a medical perspective, there is some sort of medical or physiological reason that is causing that abnormal behavior. So 3 of those reasons, or the roots behind the abnormal behavior, one could be a hormonal imbalance. One could be a chemical deficiency, or it may be the result of a brain injury. So the medical perspective is saying that there is something physically wrong with the individual that is causing this abnormal behavior into the individual. The next perspective is a psychoanalytic perspective. And psychoanalytic psychologists believe that the abnormal behavior stems from a childhood conflict over opposing wishes regarding sex and aggression. Now, this psychoanalytic perspective, this is 100% Sigmund Freud. Anytime you hear the word psychoanalytic in a psychology class, you should immediately be taking that back to Freud. And Freud believed that when someone has a disorder, that it stems from some sort of childhood conflict that they had, and that childhood conflict usually surrounded either sex or aggression. Another perspective is the behavioral perspective, and this looks at both rewards and punishments. If you remember back to the learning chapter, we talked about rewards and punishments. Well, from a behavioral perspective, it looks at rewards and punishments in the environment that determine the abnormal behavior. A fourth perspective is a cognitive perspective. And this suggests that people's thoughts and beliefs are the central component of abnormal behavior. So far we have a medical perspective, a psychoanalytic perspective, a behavioral perspective, and a cognitive perspective. We have 2 more perspectives that we're going to look at. The 5th perspective is a humanistic perspective. We haven't really discussed humanistic psychology yet, but humanistic perspective emphasizes the responsibility that people have for their own behavior, even when the behavior is abnormal. And 2 of the major researchers, whenever it comes to a humanistic perspective or humanistic psychology overall, is Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. And you can read a little bit more about their perspectives in Module 46 in the book. And that occurs on page 498. Now, the last perspective on abnormal behavior is a sociocultural perspective. And this makes the assumption that a person's behavior, both normal and abnormal behavior, is shaped by society and also the culture in which they live. So there are many different perspectives, as we just looked at, talking about why someone may have an abnormal behavior. What could be the cause behind that abnormal behavior? And we have those 6 different perspectives looking at that. This figure, figure 1, this is at the top of page 499, and this is looking at the coronavirus pandemic. So this is a study recently, 2020, and it looks at the coronavirus, or the coronavirus pandemic impacts the perception of mental health. So this graph, as it says, it shows the percentage of people who said they felt that worry or stress related to the coronavirus pandemic had a negative impact on their mental health. So a major impact is in the green and a minor impact is in the yellowish color, I guess. So you look at males, you look at females, and then you look across various races, white, black, and Hispanic. And then parents of children younger than 18, and then for those individuals who are not a parent. The highest one is for females. it had a minor impact on the perspective. When we're looking at which one had a major impact, that would be for females, that would be for Black individuals, and for Hispanic individuals, showing that the coronavirus pandemic had a major impact on their mental health. This slide is a table, again, on page 499, and it's all the various 6 different perspectives that we just talked about, a descriptive of each of those perspectives, and in the application to Chris Cole's case. So Chris Cole's, if you go back to the beginning of your chapter in the prologue of each chapter, it always gives a certain scenario, a real life example of someone who had a situation like what that chapter is going to talk about. And in the beginning of this one, it was a case of Chris Cole's. And we can employ each of the perspectives on abnormal behavior to Chris Cole's case. So again, you may want to go back and you may want to read that prologue and then come back and look at this table to see how each of those perspectives looked at Chris Cole's case. All right, the next thing is classifying abnormal behavior. So it is the ABCs of the DSM. When you hear anyone say the DSM, that stands for the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. It is currently in its 5th edition, so it is the DSM-5. And this is a manual that is used from professionals, whether it is a physician or a social worker or a psychologist or a counselor or a psychiatrist, whomever it is. They use this manual to classify and diagnose someone with a psychological disorder. And you have to make sure that before you diagnose anyone with a disorder that you are following the DSM, because you do not want to misdiagnose someone. The DSM was devised by the American Psychiatric Association. That is kind of like our governing board in psychology, the APA. And the DSM takes an atheoretical approach to identifying disorders. What this means is that it does not rely on any particular theoretical perspective. It's an atheoretical perspective. So it's not going to rely on only one. This is a table showing the various categories of disorders, and you can find this one at the bottom of page 500. This is taken out of the DSM-5. So it's a category of the disorders and in some of the examples of specific disorders that you will find within each of those. We're going to talk more specifically about each of these disorders when we get to the next module, Module 47. But you may want to come back and refer back to this slide also as you're going through and you're studying or rereading about those various disorders. So again, talking about the DSM, we have both advantages and disadvantages of the DSM in diagnosing individuals with a disorder. First off, let's talk about the advantages or the benefits of using the DSM. It provides a descriptive system. So it's going to be very descriptive in, what the disorder is, how many symptoms or what the symptoms are of that disorder, how many of the symptoms an individual needs, and for how long of a period of time they have those symptoms before they can be diagnosed. So it is very descriptive for every single disorder that is out there. It allows communication between mental health professionals from diverse backgrounds and from diverse theoretical approaches. So again, it's not going to be just psychologists or psychiatrists. It could be a counselor, a social worker, your family physician. right? So this DSM is what all of them use in diagnosing a disorder. It provides or enables researchers to explore the causes of the problem. And then the last thing, which I almost said, is that it provides a shorthand. It provides, so if someone takes shorthand, I don't know if we talk about shorthand too much anymore in today's society, but if you take shorthand, you don't have to write out every single word, right? If someone takes shorthand and they're taking notes, there are various symbols that mean various words. So the DSM provides a shorthand which professionals can describe the behaviors that tend to occur together within an individual. So it gives this shorthand approach for it. Those are the benefits. When we think about the disadvantages or the shortcomings of using the DSM, the first one is after an initial diagnosis, mental health professionals may overlook other diagnostic possibilities. So they may classify or they may, hone in on one disorder, but that may then keep them from noticing other types of disorders also. And if you read in your textbook, it gives the example of the research done that was by Dr. David Rosenhan and his colleagues. And it's talked about this on page 501. There's a section that says conning the classifiers, the shortcomings of the DSM. So I encourage you to go back and read that section on page 501 because it talks about these shortcomings, specifically by this researcher. The last slide in this module is going to look at the stigma of labeling. Whether labeling is good or bad or the other. Anytime we hear the word stigma, it usually has a negative connotation to it. So we try to think about, the stigma of labeling, how that can be, negative to someone who has a disorder. So what it says here in the center is that by placing labels on individuals, placing labels on individuals powerfully influences the way that the mental health workers perceive and interpret their actions. So that's not necessarily always a good thing. So for this reason, the diagnosis-based system of insurance coverage creates a catch-22 for mental health care professionals. So potentially stigmatizing clients with a formal diagnosis or leave them without the necessary financial support. So in order to get the financial support from your healthcare, provider, you need to have a diagnosis. But when you diagnose someone, that can influence the way that other individuals in the healthcare system looks at you. So you're either damned if you do and damned if you don't. But a lot of times you need that diagnosis in order to get the health care to pay for the treatment that you actually need. Critics of using the DSM argue that labeling an individual as abnormal provides a dehumanizing, lifelong stigma. Once you are diagnosed with a disorder and it is in your medical record, it is there to stay. It is next to impossible to get that off of your medical record. That's why as a mental health professional, you have to be so careful about diagnosing someone with a disorder because you do not want to make a mistake in doing that. So even though it does have this stigma and you are labeling someone, it nevertheless increases the reliability and validity of diagnostic categorization. So the DSM has been found to be both reliable and valid.